you have any contact with the people that actually design them?
Well, often some of the materials we started with this project by writing letters to the consulate, believe it or not. We just said, well, why not? It can't hurt, right, if we have. So some of the countries sent us kind of official information through their designers. Some of it are designed by in-house, obviously, government designers. So we got information from them, but we didn't have any direct contact in terms of like, why did we do this or why did we do that. And what was interesting was in this, of course, we didn't hear from most of them, but we did get some responses from consulate. And actually, the Swiss embassy was the first one to send us a huge package about all their sort of design, kind of documents and how they have all these rules about it. They sent us a video, they sent us all this thing. But I think it's also kind of their sort of idea, in some ways, I think their ownership of this idea of democracy, that they really, I think, kind of own some design of democracy in a way. So, but other than that, we tried to very easy to actually. We could talk to the consulates and the information about who did design this specific thing. We talked to them. It wasn't that easy.
I'm looking at all these kinds of things around limits and borders. Did it help you imagine any other kind of possible way of doing things, like some sort of possible world that everyone would have multiple passports, or people would trade passports, like, I don't know, like hockey cards, or did it make you kind of make a jump into some sort of other place? I don't know.
Well, utopia. But no, it's interesting. Actually, many restrictions have eased through this whole EU configuration, because so I don't want to paint a very kind of pessimistic picture. I think things have changed somewhat, but it's like a pendulum. Some event happens like 9/11, and things kind of go back. So, but things go kind of back and forth. But it was, personally for me, I think it was really interesting when EU started this rule, because as a kind of a Indian passport holder, every time I traveled in Europe, every country I go to, I would have had to get visa, and especially when I was a student, it was quite expensive. It would be like, if you're going to 4 countries in Europe, that's very easy to do. You're just jumping around, and you would need a visa for each country. The U.S. citizens wouldn't need that, but somebody like me would, But then, when first time when I went after the EU, and they changed this, what's called the Schengen Treaty, not Schengen, this is the treaty, what's it called? Schengen Treaty, yeah. So then, you just need one visa at the entry, wherever you enter in Europe. And after that, it's incredible, because if you're driving through, you still go through these checkposts. And I still had this sort of, immediate reaction of, where's my passport? And, looking for my bag, and there's nobody even there. You look around, there are no cars, all these things are empty, and you can just sort of drive through, So, I don't know, global, I'm not sure, this, obviously the question of security is sort of it, but there are things which I think we can go into a lot detail about, which this sort of idea of nation blending, and actually nations use this idea. I recently went to Jordan, to Amman, and took my students there last semester, and I was shocked. Jordan now you get a visa on entry. You don't even need to apply from here, and they try to make the process as easy as possible, because they're really trying to boost tourism in Jordan, and they really want it to be as easy as possible. So so you visa on entry, not just for U.S., even other citizens, you can do that. So maybe one day,
I was wondering if you thought a little bit about ownership provisions in your passport. I think in some countries you own your passport. In others you have to surrender it when it's expired.
Yes. We did that a little bit with which countries you have to surrender and which country. And that's why it was sort of interesting, because for many individuals, it's just a bureaucratic document, right? But for many individual, it's a very personal object, and the idea that you have to give up your passport, not only you have to give up, you have to actually physically surrender it. It's a very personal kind of, decision. Yeah, but, we have that somewhere in our thing, which countries allow you to surrender, and yeah. But the interesting point that really brings up is this. I think this is why, for us, this is interesting, because we saw this various ways, just in some ways kind of a bureaucratic object. It connects, in a way, it connects the individual to the state. It connects the personal to the political. It connects, just these kind of very large sort of boundaries. In a way, I think the private to the public, the most private to the most public, and all kind of come, intersect through this little object.
Have you thought of looking at money?
Actually, interesting you should say that. We haven't never, but I did it as design studio when we went to Amman in Jordan with my students at Columbia and Barnard. So one of this didn't have specifically to do with Amman, but the idea was to redesign currency. And they looked at these different ways of designing currency, which would, be either, they don't have to be based on country, right? But this idea that you could have, a universal currency. I mean, people who are more architectural historians might get a little, all this idea of universal design and etc. had its kind of own problematics. But the idea, so the idea that it wouldn't be nation-based, but it would be there was this one student who did this project. It was just a solid color. Every currency, every kind of notation was, like it was a spectrum from like red to green or something, and then the red one would be, a certain value. But then she had this elaborate system of how different countries, like to buy bread, you would need 3 reds in India, and you might need like 10 reds somewhere else, and because it couldn't have the same value. And then there was another project where they did this completely that you don't even, because currency is sort of, it's so much on electronic now. But she had this really interesting idea that the currency is not absolute, it's relative, of course, because it's in relation to another, that it's going up and down. So she wanted to kind of propose a currency which is, if whichever country you're in, it's kind of changing color. So if it's going up, let's say against the dollar, so you know exactly like what your value is relative to other currency, and you're kind of like trading, So yeah, I mean, there are certain similarities, but the same thing with currency. Again, it's this sort of, if you look at, most of them, and somebody did a project with the U.S. currency about, because they're all the presidential portraits on the currency, and it says, "In God we trust," which it's up to question really, the separation of state and religion. But yeah, brings up some of the same questions, yeah.
How often are passports redesigned?
It
depends on...
Yeah, different countries. The US just very recently redesigned their passport after, I think, about 10 years. I think the Indian ones, but I remember I think they do it like every 10 or something, because it used to have a hard cover, now it has this soft cover, with the printing technology, it changes, but it also, there's this very complicated, who allows dual citizenship and who doesn't, and every time they change certain laws, the passports, but there always has, there is this sort of tension, because there is an international body which, the size, etc., comes from the old British passport, which then the League of Nations kind of, it has been kind of the same size since, that. So there are these standards, international standards that you're supposed to follow, and we have, but I think the interesting thing that it is, so some countries are sort of taking it as this kind of nation branding exercise, some of in terms of redesign.
I guess I'm also trying to think of Marily's question about the kind of idealized state of exchanging and shuffling passports. I mean, the 1967 exhibition in Montreal, my dad had this, everyone would get this passport to get in. It was a very much idealized context where it was the first opening to the world, and you get this stamp of passport of the maybe Rwanda into your passport back then. And I was actually in Switzerland over the summer, and I was really very shocked or very impressed by the level of design that was into their passports. And I was traveling with my Canadian passport, and I was like looking at both from Switzerland, France, and I was just interested in the issue of the Chinese, how they're actually reappropriating. Do you know?
That's actually they did. I mean, we did. Yeah, we haven't gotten since in terms of what the design has come. I mean, this passport is now. I mean, this project is old now. You know, I mean, we finished about 2 years ago. But that they had hired and all that. But the Chinese case is very, very interesting because obviously even in architecture they have had so many international architects doing these signature buildings. And there is this sort of, on the one hand, you do the Chinese, there is the sort of very nationalistic kind of, at least in the visual culture. But then they really have hired a lot of international, architects, etc., to actually design building. And it's interesting. So talking about the currency project, one of my students redesigned the Chinese currency, and he kind of traced through, how it has changed. So obviously it used to have the sort of, symbolism of communism, the kind of farmers, etc. And then it goes, and now, it goes to the more recent, especially with the Olympics, the architecture, etc. So he had sort of this idea of kind of two-sided currency, where one-sided he wanted to show the kind of this idea of the Chinese government, inviting all these international architects to represent them. And on the flip side, he wanted to have artists, and he looked at a lot of Chinese artists' work, which have been now recognized internationally through all these art fairs, etc. And many of those works are, they're kind of critical commentary against the sort of nationalism of China or the problematic. So this idea of branding versus protest, on kind of being reflected on a currency, in kind of a two-sided currency. Yes?
Could you explain more about one of the projects where you investigated the individual story in relation to the passports?
Because that's when we started, if you kind of read some of the stories, you would see how this idea of a passport for some is kind of this idea of, it's kind of a personal desire to be in two countries, right, and not being represented. So kind of an immigrant who works in the U.S. still sends all their money back home, like one of the projects that's in the exhibit. But so still wants to kind of hold on to this dual, not only identity, but actually participates, So the idea of showing that a person right now, really you can understand a person almost as a network of countries. It's equally important to have those two countries in their lives represented, and thus the passport. And then we have the story of, of a kind of a Russian woman, which is also, as I said, they came from kind of databases of, a lot of different NGOs, etc., who really developed this, what's called a passport portfolio. So she's among the discounted one, where she, has passports. She's really developing a passport portfolio for business purposes. So the idea was that, we can speculate on these, but the reason we started doing this research and kind of turning them into stories is really, and this is through which these kind of 4 categories emerged, is, how are people using this idea of multiple nations, working and living in them. Some are, disadvantaged because of that, and some are obviously exploiting the system. So the idea was to actually, through the stories, present these different categories that were kind of abstract category, but to show where they came from.
Yeah, you said that the project is now a result, but I'm wondering if it's not, even for someone else to think of driving license and also national ID card.
Yeah.
For instance, moving through one country with an ID card, by car with driving license, and then across borders, and I guess there, by boat, this does it passport. It seems to me they're also
They're linked.
to somewhere or it's very specific
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, this project could be huge if I could work for this all my life. No, but the thing about it is the driving license thing is very interesting, again, in the US context, because right now, with the taxi drivers, I don't know if you've heard about this story, which actually the mayor has for once, I think, acted in the right way, because right now, actually, you can have a driving license and you don't need to prove your citizenship. And they were going to introduce this law where they were going to change that, but luckily, actually, they sort of put that a little bit under the rug, so they're not going to do that. But this idea of ID cards, etc., and then in reverse, in India, actually, there's this new sort of, there used to be, the old system was the kind of ration cards where they were called ration cards because you could actually get subsidized rice or something, etc. So there were various ways of economically determining what was your status, let's say, and then you might. But now everyone's getting this ID card, and it was very interesting with all the kind of informal housing and slums, etc. That there are a couple of very, very interesting projects because they're very, it's very difficult to say how many people actually are living there and who's related to who, etc. So they're actually, in some ways it is a little scary because they're using Google Earth mapping, live sort of mapping of these huge slums to kind of really determine where the houses are, who belongs to where. The other project is, again for me, it kind of has this double-sided sort of, it's problematic in one way but interesting in another ways, where they gave cell phones to kids, and because the kids really know how to navigate the slums and they really know the community and they gave them kind of free cell phones to enter this sort of data about their friends and relatives and who in exchange for free cell phones. So I don't know. But this whole issue of ID cards is very interesting because passports are only for kind of international travel, but the local ways of documenting people and counting people and new technologies are.
What about duplication of passports? Are there any cases where there's, well, of course, I guess the Occidentalist countries would be in the mire or in a ligne de mire of passport, but are there any levels of different niveau de différente sécurité for every one of the passports? I guess different levels of security for every.
The counterfeiting kind of
in terms
issues.
of counterfeiting?
Yeah, this is what I was showing you, all those various, printing techniques that are actually very, very difficult to simulate. Because, of course, with the color copier now being so highly, so kind of the resolution you can get on color copiers is incredible, right? You can pretty much, and apparently the color copier for often, and I haven't been able to really confirm this, but I was told once by somebody who worked in the Xerox Corporation that the color copier technology existed for a long time in terms of the resolution they could achieve, but they weren't releasing it commercially because otherwise you can copy currency and then you can just counterfeit currency, and they were really, really become problematic. I'm not sure if that's what your question is, but it's the counterfeiting is, that's where you saw, the kind of aesthetics of the passport, which I thought were really, they're really striking in some of the countries, and it's really all about counterfeiting and how to prevent that.
Is it one side of the first image that we had that it is, with the colors and it's kind of like mapping the world somehow, and I was thinking if you actually ever looked into, I imagine that because of in a custom office you have this, I don't know if it's a custom office that have that map very clear, but something like that color, like a person coming at this point of dual. You say this started saying citizenship is normally is blood and place where you or but now that's completely confused. So I was curious if you actually reaction to as soon as, you know, there is a passport with a certain color or there is an easiness. I know in Europe, for example, you know, you do 2 different lines.
Right.
Europe,
Yeah.
Like kind of like if they facilitate the access or not.
Yeah. No, I mean you just put color, like to see whether you like scan whether it's the right color, and then you can go and kind of not. I mean, what is interesting? I mean, I think may have been talking to somebody about it. What's interesting, actually, many countries are not. At least what we found, and certainly we found in the case of U.S. is that I mean, surprisingly, they're not. There is no database right now that says who's a dual citizen. They're really interested in whether you're a citizen or not. They're not that interested which other countries you're a citizen of. Which to me sounds like, shouldn't they be interested? But, it's one of these things that also, like, at one point, the U.S. security had this sort of idea that when internationals come through, they know the checkpoint that you've come through, but then they don't necessarily track where you've been after that, like if you go from New York to Washington to California, etc. They know when you enter, they know when you exit, but they don't necessarily know unless you were on some list or whatever, But they wanted to do this. This was the kind of after 9/11, this whole sort of idea of total information system that was proposed by Rumsfeld and all that. It was all very kind of scary, but they found that the amount of data they would gather with that, it's like one Library of Congress worth of data every day, and they don't even have the technical capacity to actually process that kind of data. Just the sheer, and they kind of gave up because it was just impossible for them to really maintain that and support that level of data. Predict. I mean, again, I think with this project, we sort of felt like we kind of it was just to kind of generate this discussion. It wasn't like we were trying to reach, and we could, have this sort of effect that we would be redesigning passwords or, kind of, but the idea was just to kind of, use these kind of issues and just very informal sort of exhibits to just put this question on the table, not necessarily to solve it or to, and I don't know if it is solvable in a way. So thing our country is defined by its edges. There were some kind of nasty, patriotic comments, which of course we edited out. I mean, maybe we should have them in here, but, it was just, they used language that I wouldn't necessarily like to have publicly represented, but you can imagine they weren't all very, happy.
If people want to see more about this project, there's some of it is online.
Yeah, so this whole publication is on this eSoup. I can send you the links. There's also a kind of a website that, the website was really, we had done this more, we had done the website when we were doing workshops, so it's not really active right now, but we were just using it as a kind of way to, so this is the sort of, the idea was website that we would introduce the projects and then we would, I don't think this probably has, but basically the idea that some of the ballots that we were doing that you could kind of submit online kind of comments, but it really, the website was used to introduce the project. We found it was easier. Sometimes it's actually better to have just very informal and handy technology, so it was easier for us to then just hand out printed ballots and, and then just kind of, but there is a website that kind of discusses it more in sort of detail. And so this is sort of, and again, I mean, it was sort of important for us to always have this kind of idea, so it doesn't become so kind of individual-centric, the idea that, so it's just like in your opinion, what basis should citizenship be determined, but then select one answer that you did not select, and then say why someone else would select that answer. So it was important for us to kind of keep a discussion at a kind of a more general level, where it's not so much about what you think, really, but it's really why it matters what you think could be different from what someone else thinks. So the workshops were really kind of designed for that kind of a discussion. Because, one of the things about every time in a more informal setting, this is again, few years ago now when I was working on the project, every time I described the project, everybody had this story. Oh, let me tell you my story about my passport, and somebody would have it, or ID. You know, and this person was asking me the question about the stories. It sort of came from there too, because we just heard so many personal, you know, kind of, so everybody would have some story to tell about some experience in the passport office or visa or, you know, ID or something. So it is kind of, you know, so the website is still up, and you know, if people are kind of interested, you can go and look. But there's some results and all that we're not really tracking. We were tracking it at some point, but it would, I don't know if this is still working, but it would show, it was just sort of using the sort of symbols or the basis of citizenship, and then we were kind of, you know, the idea was that in a very visual kind of way that you can kind of talk about these issues.
Which is the passport you think, which country is the best design? Have the best design for a passport, in your opinion?
In my opinion, well, I'm the sort of minimal, you know, kind of, I don't like you know, the kind of overly nationalistic or traditional symbolism. I actually, if I was to design a passport, I think this idea of geography, you know, this idea of like where is the country in relationship to whom, you know, just a kind of, so I like the Honduras passport I was showing because it's just a map with the country, like this is where we are, these are our neighbors, these are the people who we want to be with. If you want to go inside from here to here, you can go, you don't need a visa, you know. So, you know, that's my opinion. But you know, and you could say it's a kind of a matter of fact aesthetic, yet it's very striking. I think that, you know, just the fact that you can look at it, like I can be waving it, you know, to someone and somebody would see it. This comes from, I used to do a lot of information architecture, etc., because I did work a lot as a new media designer, so it comes from very, you know, pragmatic design sense. So one of the projects I'm just very currently working on, it's very much in process, and this might kind of work with this. So it's kind of an iPhone, iPad app. It actually was just launched last week, so I'm kind of quite excited about it. But it's this, again, you think, I didn't pick a small enough thing to think about, so I went even smaller. What's the smaller? So now we're looking at alphabets, and we're looking at multilingual alphabets, but really thinking about new technologies and how it has kind of impact on alphabets. So this is just a very simple app which shows 3 languages, English, Hindi, and Greek. And this is just kind of a prototype. This has sound, so it's so you type a word and it will pick the letters and it will tell you the closest matches in Hindi and in Greek. But these are all, of course, transliterations. But what's interesting about alphabets as characters is they are the completely incompatible systems, right? So the Hindi alphabet is completely, different than English. It has many more letters than English. So the idea is to kind of study these sort of commonalities and differences at the level of a character and an alphabet. And through kind of this iPhone interface, really start, kind of talking about, because also this idea that, the keyboards, etc., as you know, have big impacts on how we thought about how we experience alphabet. So it also has these installation, and this is, as I said, it's all in process. So this also has a website. So this is kind of this interface where when you trace one letter, you get embedded in it other languages. So again, a little section. So this is, and then what's another interesting, and this will be the last thing. So this is sort of this idea of ordering
Kappa,
the alphabet order
G,
and where
Gamma
it comes
Kappa,
from. So this
Gamma
is
Gamma,
the Hindi order. It starts with the
Zeta,
alphabet.
J,
The Hindi is very kind of, it's
Zeta,
all by sound.
Da,
It's a phonetic, so it goes ka, ka, ga, 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 cha, cha, cha,
Nita,
cha,
Ta,
and and English,
No.
is
N,
nobody really know where the
Mm,
ordering system comes from, but it comes, it goes back to Latin and then goes to Greek. That's why we wanted to have Greek as another kind of language. So this resolution isn't very good, but if I fast forward it, so it kind of, it traces which languages, which letters are matching, and then it goes. And then the letters that don't, the letters that don't exist in English go away. And then,
D,
and then English alphabet is organized according to the Hindi order.
Kappa,
So
Gamma
just this
Kappa,
sort of idea
Gamma
of,
Gamma, Tap
what would
Zeta,
happen if you
Zeta, Nita,
reorganize
Ta,
the
Ni,
letters
Pi,
according to
Si, Ni,
different
Pi,
systems.
Si,
But you
Ni,
can also,
Ro, Lambda,
it could be
Zeta,
a lingual
Sigma,
system. It could
Phi,
also be like a
Alpha,
QWERTY typewriter.
Iota,
Or then you can start
Epsilon,
looking at new
Epsilon,
technologies and how the
Alpha,
character is
Beta,
actually, the
Omega,
alphabet is
Omega,
sort of
Alpha,
forming.
Ni, Nita, Epsilon,
Okay, no lady.
Well, thank you very much.
Sure.